Back in 1809, Napoleon Bonaparte was basically the master of Europe. His empire, it looked totally invincible. His genius, unmatched. But then in just 5 short years, the whole thing comes crashing down. So how does that even happen? How does an empire that stretches all the way from Spain to Poland just collapse? Well, the answer is a classic mistake: fighting a war on two fronts. A fatal overreach that was going to bleed his armies completely dry. Napoleon himself actually gave us a huge clue. He called one of his wars a bleeding ulcer. Just think about that image. It's this constant, painful drain that he could never ever heal. We're not talking about one big, glorious battle here. This was a slow, grinding disease, something that was weakening his empire from the inside out, right at the moment he was turning to face an even bigger threat. Okay, to really get the scale of the fall, you first have to appreciate just how high he was. So picture this with me. It's 1809. Napoleon has just absolutely smashed the Austrian army at Wagram. He is literally rewriting the map of Europe. He's marrying into one of the oldest royal families on the continent. The guy looks completely and utterly unstoppable. But that hidden ulcer we talked about, it was already there, just festering beneath the surface. So here's how we're going to break down this epic collapse. First up, we're going to look at that hidden ulcer. Then we dive into the absolute catastrophe in Russia. After that, we'll see how the tide turned back in Spain, how Napoleon's enemies cooked up a brilliant new plan, and finally, how it all exploded at the massive Battle of Nations. Okay, let's get right into it. Part 1, that first fatal problem. We're talking about the long, brutal, and, let's be honest, completely unwinnable war in Spain and Portugal. This was the war that Napoleon himself would deeply regret ever starting. And why did he? All to try and force his economic blockade against his arch-nemesis, Great Britain. So the French get to Spain and they're facing a totally new kind of enemy. See, it wasn't just another army in fancy uniforms. It was the people themselves. They called it la guerrilla, which literally means the little war. And that's exactly what it was. This wasn't about big, organized battles. Nope. This was all about ambushes, hit-and-run raids, constantly attacking supply lines. It was basically the prototype for modern insurgency, and it tied down tens of thousands of Napoleon's best troops, forcing them to guard every single road and every tiny outpost. And this created what was, well, an impossible choice for Napoleon's generals. Check this out. If they spread their forces out to try and hunt down the guerrillas, the British general, Wellington, and his professional army could just pick them off one by one. But if they bunched up their forces to fight Wellington in a big battle, the guerrillas would just pop right back up and retake the entire countryside behind them. It was a total strategic nightmare, a classic catch-22. There was just no right answer. And you know what? The guerrillas were only half the problem. While they were this constant drain, you also had the stubborn, incredibly professional British-led army ready to fight the big battles. There's this amazing quote from one of Napoleon's top generals, Marshal Soult. After a really bloody battle, he basically says it all. He thought he'd won. He'd attacked them from all sides, broken their center, but the British infantry just wouldn't break. As he famously put it, they simply did not know how to run. All right, so with all that mess happening in Spain, let's shift gears to the second front. And this is where we see Napoleon's greatest blunder. While his best armies are getting bled dry in Spain, Napoleon decides now is the perfect time to settle a score with Tsar Alexander of Russia. And how's he going to do it? By launching the single largest invasion Europe had ever seen. What could possibly go wrong? Just look at that number. We're talking about roughly 600,000 men. This wasn't just an army, it was a city on the march, a multinational force pulled from every single corner of his empire. The whole idea was to be this overwhelming show of force, right? Something that would scare the Tsar into negotiating in just a few weeks. But the Russians had other plans. They absolutely refused to play by Napoleon's rules. They just kept retreating. And as they did, they burned everything behind them. It was a scorched earth strategy. Napoleon finally got the big battle he wanted at Borodino, but it was an absolute bloodbath that didn't decide anything. He gets to Moscow, this great prize, only to find it's empty and on fire. And that's when it all truly unravels. Then came the Great Retreat, a name that, even today, is shorthand for military disaster. The scale of this catastrophe, it's just hard to wrap your head around. And what's really interesting here is what these numbers tell us. Everyone talks about the Russian winter killing the army, but that's not the whole story. The biggest killer wasn't the cold. It was disease, exhaustion, and pure starvation. And they claimed most of their victims before the first snowflake even fell. The final tally is just staggering. For every 12 men who marched into Russia, only 2 came back alive. His Grande Armée wasn't just defeated, it was completely, utterly annihilated. Napoleon races back to Paris, and even he has to admit it. He tells his government, "I've made a grave mistake." Now, he's still confident. He says he can fix it, he'll just raise a new army full of fresh young recruits, but it was too late. His enemies all across Europe could smell blood in the water. That aura of invincibility that had surrounded him for a decade, it was gone. Forever. So think about this. With his main army shattered in Russia, Napoleon is desperate. He needs to build a new army to fight in Germany, and he needs it fast. So where does he get the experienced soldiers? He pulls them from Spain. He's forced to yank thousands of his best veteran troops out of that bleeding ulcer. And this move dangerously weakens his Spanish front and gives his old nemesis, Wellington, the exact opening he had been patiently waiting for. So Wellington pounces. In 1813, he launches this absolutely brilliant offensive. He outmaneuvers the French at every turn, forcing them back, until he finally pins them down at a place called Vittoria. The result wasn't just a victory, it was a total rout. The French army basically disintegrated, losing everything in the chaotic retreat. Their entire treasury, almost every single one of their cannons. That was it. The war in Spain was, for all intents and purposes, over. Okay, so you've got this disaster in Russia and a total defeat in Spain. What happens next? Well, a massive new alliance forms. All those old monarchies of Europe, the ones who had been terrified of Napoleon for years, they see their chance. They finally put aside all their old rivalries and unite for one single purpose: to take him down. And this becomes the Sixth Coalition. For Napoleon, this is an absolute nightmare. You've got Russia and Prussia, both just hungry for revenge. Austria, and get this is the empire of his own father-in-law, turns against him. Even Sweden, which is led by one of his own former marshals, joins the fight. When you add in the ongoing wars with Britain, Spain, and Portugal, it basically means that for the first time, it's Napoleon against, well, pretty much all of Europe. But this time, they're not just bigger. They're smarter. They've learned from years of getting beaten. They come up with a new strategy called the Trachenberg Plan. And it's simple, but it is genius. The rule is, do not fight Napoleon himself. Avoid him at all costs. Instead, go after his marshals, his generals. Use your bigger armies to beat up on them, wear down his forces piece by piece. They would only all come together to fight the emperor himself when the odds were stacked completely, overwhelmingly in their favor. And this brings us to the climax of the whole story. This is where that Trachenberg Plan really pays off. Napoleon, he's desperate now. He needs one huge, decisive battle to turn everything around. And he gets his wish near a city called Leipzig in Germany. This is going to be the biggest battle in European history up until World War I. But Napoleon's situation is just dire. Yeah, he has a new army, and it's big, but it's mostly made up of teenagers, raw recruits with little training. And as the coalition armies start to converge on Leipzig from north, south, and east, they've got him outnumbered almost 2-to-1 in men and more than 2-to-1 in cannons. The trap is set. For 3 brutal days, the battle just rages. And to their credit, Napoleon's young soldiers fight with incredible courage. But they're just slowly, inevitably ground down by the sheer weight of numbers. The real turning point, the real dagger in the heart, comes when his German allies from Saxony literally switch sides in the middle of the battle. The final act is just pure disaster. The one and only bridge his army needs to retreat is blown up way too early, trapping tens of thousands of his troops on the wrong side of the river. So the key takeaway here is simple. This wasn't just another loss on the scoreboard. This was the final, complete destruction of his field army. The losses were absolutely catastrophic. And unlike the coalition, Napoleon just didn't have anyone left to call on. The last of his hardened veterans were gone, and the new army of boys he'd scraped together, it was shattered. The Battle of Leipzig, they called it the Battle of the Nations. It broke his hold on Germany for good. Just like that, his empire outside of France completely collapsed. The road to Paris was wide open. The end was finally in sight. His last epic gamble had failed. So that leaves us with a really interesting question to chew on. Napoleon himself always blamed that catastrophic Russian winter for his downfall. But when you really look back, when you think about that bleeding ulcer in Spain, that constant, grinding drain of men and money, and this impossible second front he opened up, you really have to wonder, don't you? Was the invasion of Russia the cause of his downfall? Or was it just the final, fatal symptom of an empire that had already been stretched way, way past its breaking point?